Tonight, we are going to travel slowly into a world of mountain kingdoms, dusty roads, polished bronze armor, midnight campfires, and cities whose names still sound like echoes from a very old dream. We are going to follow the life of Alexander of Macedon, remembered by history as Alexander the Great, a boy who inherited a restless kingdom at the edge of the Greek world and then carried his army farther than almost anyone around him believed a man could go. This is not a story told in a rush. There is no need to hurry across the Hellespont or through Asia Minor or into the wide plains of Persia. We will walk beside the story patiently, as if moving with a caravan under a quiet sky, letting each scene appear and pass in its own time. Alexander's life is often told as a chain of battles, as if he were only a sword moving from one place to the next. But underneath the victories was a human story that feels stranger and more fragile. There was a child raised in the shadow of a powerful father. There was a mother who filled his imagination with divine ancestry and destiny. There was a horse no one else could master. There were teachers, rivals, companions, wounds, feasts, griefs, and long nights where the philosophians might to understand why people still speak his name after more than 2,000 years. We have to begin before the empire, before the gold, before the cities named after him, when he was only a prince in Macedon. Macedon was not Athens, and it was not Sparta. To the polished city-states of southern Greece, Macedon could seem rough, northern, half familiar and half foreign, a land of kings, horsemen, highlands, forests, hunting, and hard military discipline. But by the time Alexander was born, Macedon was changing. His father, Philip II, had taken a kingdom that once seemed vulnerable and turned it into a military machine. He reorganized the army, strengthened the cavalry, trained the infantry, and made the long Macedonian sarissa, a spear far longer than the usual Greek hoplite spear, into a forest of points that could move across a battlefield like one disciplined creature. Alexander was born in 356 BC, in Pella, the Macedonian capital. Later stories surrounded his birth with signs and wonders, because famous lives attract legends the way desert temples attract sand. Ancient writers loved to say that great men announced themselves before they could speak. Some stories connected his birth with omens, dreams, thunder, or the burning of distant temples. We do not need to believe every wonder in order to feel what those stories were trying to say. From the beginning, Alexander was remembered not as an ordinary prince, but as a child onto whom people projected expectation. His life would become so enormous that even his birth could not remain simple. His mother was Olympias, princess of Epirus, fierce, proud, religious, and unforgettable. Ancient writers often portray her as passionate and dangerous, though we must remember that such portraits were written by men living in worlds suspicious of politically powerful women. Still, even through hostile sources, Olympias appears as a force. She told Alexander that his ancestry reached back to Achilles, the hero of the Iliad, and perhaps even to something divine. Whether Alexander believed every word in the way a child believes a bedtime story, or whether he gradually learned to use such claims as royal symbolism, we cannot know. But the idea of heroic ancestry entered him early. Before he conquered cities, he learned to imagine himself inside a story larger than ordinary life. Philip, his father, was a different kind of lesson. He was not a dream of divine blood, but the practical reality of power. Philip could negotiate, bribe, threaten, marry for advantage, forgive when useful, punish when necessary, and turn enemies into tools. He was a soldier and statesman, scarred in body and mind, a man who had learned that kingdoms survive through patience as much as courage. For Alexander, Philip was both model and rival. The son admired the father's achievements, but he also grew under the uncomfortable knowledge that almost everything he would inherit had first been built by another man. That tension mattered, Alexander's ambition was not born in empty space, it grew in the shadow of Philip's greatness, where admiration and competition could become almost the same emotion. One of the most famous stories from Alexander's youth is the taming of Bucephalus, the great horse that no one else could manage. The tale may be polished by memory, but it survives because it reveals something essential about how people wanted to understand him. The horse was restless, frightened by its own shadow, and the adults around Alexander saw only danger. The boy noticed the fear. He turned the horse toward the sun so the shadow disappeared, spoke gently, mounted carefully, and rode. Whether every detail happened exactly as later writers describe is less important than the image itself. Alexander wins not by brute strength, but by observation. He sees what others miss. In that quiet moment, the conqueror of Asia is imagined first as a child who understands fear. When Alexander was a teenager, Philip gave him one of the most famous teachers in history, Aristotle. The philosopher taught him and other noble boys at Macedonia, a place that later memory turned into a kind of sacred classroom before the storm. There, under shaded walks and among companions who would later become generals, governors, rivals, and kings in their own right, Alexander studied literature, ethics, medicine, geography, and Greek thought. He learned Homer deeply, especially the Iliad, and carried a reverence for Achilles that followed him across the world. For a young prince trained to command armies, Homer was not just poetry, it was a mirror of honor, rage, friendship, glory, and the terrible price of being remembered. It is calming to imagine those days at Macedonia, before everything widened. Young men reciting verses, horses stamping outside, tutors speaking under trees, maps unrolled across tables, the world beyond Macedonia still large and partly unknown. Some of those boys would die beside Alexander, some would outlive him and divide his empire, some would become names in footnotes and fragments, but for a moment they were simply companions being trained for a future that none of them could fully see. Their world was smaller then. Persia was still the great empire to the east. Egypt still belonged to Persian kings. Babylon still waited beyond desert and river. India was almost a word at the edge of imagination. Alexander's first taste of real command came before he became king. At 16, while Philip was away, he acted as regent of Macedon and dealt with rebellion in the north. At 18, he fought at the Battle of Chaeronea in 338 BC, where Philip defeated the combined forces of Athens and Thebes. Ancient tradition places Alexander in command of the companion cavalry and credits him with a decisive charge against the Theban sacred band. Again, details can be debated, but the larger truth is clear enough. Before he was 20, Alexander had seen the machinery of battle from the inside. He had watched disciplined formations collide, seen courage become death in a single afternoon, and learned that victory could change the fate of entire cities. Chaeronea gave Philip control over Greece, but it also taught Greece to fear Macedon. Philip created the League of Corinth, presenting himself as leader of a united Greek campaign against Persia. The old dream of punishing Persia for past invasions now became official policy, but history turned abruptly. In 336 BC, during a public celebration, Philip was assassinated by a bodyguard named Pausanias. The moment was theatrical, bloody, and politically dangerous. Alexander was only about 20 years old. A kingdom built by a formidable father suddenly belonged to a son surrounded by rivals, suspicion, and uncertainty. The world did not pause to let him grieve. The first conquest Alexander had to make was not Persia, it was Macedon itself. A young king could be destroyed quickly if the army hesitated, if noble families doubted him, if enemies sensed weakness, or if half-brothers and cousins became banners for rebellion. Alexander moved with terrifying speed. He secured the loyalty of the army, eliminated potential rivals, and made it clear that youth would not mean softness. This is one of the darker beginnings of his story. The boy who could calm a frightened horse also knew that a throne could not survive if too many people believed they had a better claim to sit on it. From the first weeks of his reign, speed became his signature. Rebellions stirred in Greece, where some city-states hoped Philip's death had broken Macedonian power. Alexander marched south and forced recognition of his authority. Then trouble came from the north, and he campaigned through Thrace and Illyria with such rapid movement that rumors of his death spread before he returned. Thebes, believing itself free, revolted. Alexander appeared before it like a storm that had crossed the mountains faster than expected. Thebes fell in 335 BC, and the city was destroyed, except for temples and the house traditionally associated with the poet Pindar. The destruction of Thebes is one of the first moments where the dream of Alexander becomes difficult to hold without discomfort. It was not a gentle warning. Thousands were killed or enslaved, and Greece understood. The young king could admire poetry, speak of heroic ancestry, and carry Homer in his imagination, but he could also erase a city to make a political point. For a sleep history story, we do not need to shout this judgment. We can let it rest quietly. Alexander's greatness was never simple goodness. It was energy, brilliance, danger, charisma, and violence moving together in one young body. Once Greece was quiet behind him, Alexander turned toward Asia. In 334 BC, he crossed the Hellespont with an army that was small compared with the empire he intended to challenge. Persia, ruled by Darius III, was vast, old, wealthy, and administratively sophisticated. Its roads, satrapies, palaces, tribute systems, and royal traditions stretched across territories far beyond Macedonian experience. But great empires can be slow to respond to a sudden, concentrated threat, and Alexander's army was not an ordinary, invading force. It was the weapon Philip had forged, now held by a son with an imagination too restless for borders. Before marching deeply into Asia, Alexander visited Troy, or at least the place Greeks believed Troy had stood. There he honored Achilles, the hero whose story had shaped his mind since youth. We can picture the scene in the sleep of history, the young king standing among old stones and wind, offering sacrifice to a warrior who may have felt more real to him than many living men. Achilles had won eternal fame, but died young. Alexander knew that bargain. Perhaps he did not fear it. Perhaps he believed glory was worth the shortening of life. Perhaps at 22, death still seemed like a distant god, waiting far behind him. The first major battle against Persian forces came at the Granicus River in 334 BC. The Persian satraps had assembled cavalry on the far bank, and the river itself made the crossing dangerous. Some advisors urged caution. Alexander chose attack. The battle was chaotic and personal. Ancient accounts describe him fighting in the thick of danger, nearly killed before being saved by Clytus the Black, a companion who would later reappear in the story in a far more tragic way. Granicus opened Asia Minor to Alexander. It also established the pattern he would lead from the front, inspire by risking himself, and make his own survival part of the army's belief. After Granicus, cities along the coast faced choices. Some welcomed him, some resisted. Alexander needed the coast because the Persian fleet remained dangerous, and he understood that armies do not move through dreams alone. They need ports, supplies, money, loyalty, and the slow administrative work that rarely appears in heroic paintings. While the story remembers the charging cavalry, the empire was also built by negotiations, garrisons, tax arrangements, engineers, scribes, local elites, and the careful turning of conquered places into usable ground. That is one reason Alexander's campaigns are so fascinating. They were not only military movement, they were political improvisation at enormous scale. At Gordium, Alexander encountered the famous knot tied to an ancient wagon. Legend said that whoever loosened the Gordian knot would rule Asia. Different versions tell the story differently. In the most famous, Alexander simply cut through the knot with his sword. In another, he removed the pin that held it together. The meaning is what survived. Where others saw an impossible puzzle, Alexander created an answer. The story became symbolic because it matched the way his career felt to later generations. He did not always solve problems in the expected way. Sometimes he moved around them, sometimes he broke them. In 333 BC, Alexander met Darius himself at Issus, a battle fought in difficult terrain where Persian numbers could not fully unfold. Darius was not a foolish king, despite the way victorious stories sometimes make defeated rulers seem smaller. He commanded a vast empire under extreme pressure, facing an opponent who moved faster than imperial systems liked. At Issus, Alexander drove toward the Persian center, and Darius fled when the battle turned against him. The Persian royal family fell into Alexander's hands. The young Macedonian now possessed not only battlefield victory, but a powerful opportunity to show what kind of king he wished to appear to be. Alexander treated Darius's mother, wife, and children with respect. Ancient writers emphasize this restraint, and whether partly idealized or not, the political value was obvious. He was presenting himself not as a raider, but as a legitimate king who could inherit Persian dignity. Every empire requires a story about why it deserves obedience. Alexander began shaping his. He was avenger of Greece, liberator of cities, conqueror of Persia, admirer of heroic honor, and increasingly, in his own imagination, something like a world ruler. The titles grew around him like layers of gold. Darius offered terms after Issus, including territory and marriage alliances, according to ancient accounts. Alexander refused. One famous anecdote has Parmenion saying that if he were Alexander, he would accept, and Alexander answering that he would too, if he were Parmenion. Whether exact or polished by tradition, the story captures the difference between a cautious general and a king who had begun to think in impossible horizons. Alexander did not want a share of Asia. He wanted the whole struggle settled on his own terms. This was ambition so large it could look like destiny from one angle and recklessness from some. Before he could strike at the Persian heartland, Alexander had to control the eastern Mediterranean. The island city of Tyre refused to admit him on his terms. Tyre was proud, wealthy, fortified, and difficult to reach. Alexander responded with one of the most astonishing sieges of the ancient world, building a causeway from the mainland toward the island under constant attack. The work was slow and brutal. Stones, timber, towers, ships, divers, engineers, archers, and siege engines turned the sea itself into a battlefield. For months, the army labored against walls and water. Tyre fell in 332 BC. The punishment was severe, and again the story darkens. Many were killed, and many more enslaved. Alexander's victories were not clean legends. They were human catastrophes for those on the wrong side of his will. Yet from the viewpoint of strategy, Tyre's fall secured the coast and demonstrated that almost no obstacle could wait him out. He had turned water into road, defiance into ruin, and delay into another proof of his persistence. For his followers, this must have deepened the sense that they were marching with a man whom ordinary limitations did not easily stop. From Tyre, Alexander moved south. Gaza resisted and was taken after siege. Then Egypt opened to him. Compared with the grinding brutality of Tyre, Egypt felt almost like a ceremonial passage. The Egyptians had lived under Persian rule and did not necessarily see Alexander only as invader. He presented himself as restorer, honored Egyptian gods, and was recognized in pharaonic terms. In Egypt, the conqueror learned another language of kingship. A Macedonian king could become a Greek hero, a Persian successor, and an Egyptian pharaoh, depending on which sacred doorway he passed through. Near the Mediterranean coast, Alexander founded Alexandria in 331 BC. He reportedly chose the site himself, imagining harbors, streets, walls, and a future city where there was still sand and shoreline. Many cities would carry his name, but Alexandria in Egypt became the most famous. Long after Alexander was gone, it would become a center of learning, trade, scholarship, and memory, home to the great library and lighthouse in later centuries. Founding a city is a different kind of conquest. Battles seize the present. Cities speak to the future. In Alexandria, Alexander left not only a footprint, but a seed. From Egypt, Alexander made the strange and difficult journey to the Oracle of Ammon at Siwa, deep in the western desert. The road was harsh, and later stories filled the journey with signs of divine favor: guiding birds, miraculous rain, desert protection. At Siwa, the oracle greeted him in a way later interpreted as confirming divine sonship. The details are uncertain, and ancient sources differ, but the effect on Alexander's image was lasting. After Siwa, the language around him became more charged. Was he merely king? Was he son of Zeus Ammon? Was divinity a political costume, a private belief, or something between? For sleep, we can imagine the desert night after Siwa, the army resting under stars, camels kneeling in sand, priests speaking in a language many Macedonians did not understand. Alexander alone, with words that may have confirmed what his mother had whispered long ago. If a young man, already inclined toward heroic destiny, is told by sacred authority that he has a divine father, what happens inside him? Does it steady him, or loosen him from ordinary restraint? The answer is not simple, but the question follows him for the rest of his life. In 331 BC, Alexander left Egypt and marched toward the decisive confrontation with Darius. The two kings met at Gaugamela, near Arbela, on ground Darius had prepared for his larger army and scythed chariots. The Persian king wanted space, and space he had. Ancient numbers for the Persian army are often exaggerated, but there is no doubt Alexander faced a force far larger than his own. The night before battle became legendary. Some said Darius's camp glowed with countless fires across the plain, while the Macedonians rested in a smaller darkness, waiting for morning. Alexander's tactics at Gaugamela were a masterpiece of controlled movement. He shifted, angled, refused to be swallowed by the Persian line, drew parts of the enemy out of position, and then struck toward the center when the opening came. The Macedonian phalanx, cavalry, light troops, and commanders worked in coordination under extreme pressure. Darius fled again, and this time the defeat broke the power of the Achaemenid Empire. Gaugamela was not the end of all resistance, but it was the moment after which the Persian imperial structure could no longer claim the same authority. Alexander had beaten the great king in open battle. After Gaugamela, Babylon opened its gates. Imagine what that meant to men from Macedon and Greece. Babylon, ancient and enormous, with walls, temples, canals, priests, astronomers, gardens, and memories older than their own kingdoms. Alexander entered not simply as a general, but as a king, accepting the submission of one of the world's great cities. He sacrificed to local gods, respected Babylonian traditions, and allowed administrative continuity where useful. He was learning, with astonishing speed, that conquest required adaptation. To rule Asia, he could not remain only Macedonian. He had to become legible to the worlds he conquered. From Babylon, he moved to Susa, one of the Persian royal capitals, where immense treasures came into his possession. Then to Persepolis, ceremonial heart of Persian kingship. There, in 330 BC, the royal palace was burned. Ancient writers disagree about whether the burning was planned revenge for Persian destruction in Greece, a drunken act, or a symbolic gesture that later seemed regrettable. Whatever the cause, the image is unforgettable. The palace of kings lit by fire, carved columns glowing, cedar beams collapsing, conquest turning into smoke. Alexander had come to overthrow Persia, and at Persepolis, the old empire seemed to burn before his eyes. Yet fire does not solve the problem of empire. Darius had fled east, and Alexander pursued him across long distances. Before Alexander could capture him, Darius was betrayed and murdered by Bessus, one of his own satraps. When Alexander found the dying or dead king, later tradition says he treated him with respect and pursued Bessus as a regicide. This was politically useful, but it may also have touched Alexander's sense of royal honor. Darius alive was an enemy. Darius murdered by a subordinate became a symbol. By avenging him, Alexander could present himself as rightful successor rather than foreign destroyer. The chase carried Alexander deeper into lands far from Macedon, Parthia, Aria, Drangiana, Bactria, and Sogdiana. The campaign changed character. Grand set-piece battles gave way to mountain warfare, sieges of rocks and fortresses, local resistance, ambushes, harsh landscapes, and long supply lines. These years are sometimes less famous than Issus or Gaugamela, but they may have tested Alexander more deeply. It is one thing to defeat an imperial army in a day, it is another to hold restless highlands where loyalty shifts, terrain protects rebels, and victory must be repeated valley by valley. In these eastern campaigns, Alexander founded cities, settled veterans, married into local elites, and experimented with ways to bind the conquered regions to his rule. His marriage to Roxana, daughter of a local noble in Bactria, or Sogdiana, was both personal and political. Ancient writers describe her as beautiful, but beauty is the lazy language sources often use when they do not know a woman's inner life. Roxana stood at the meeting point of conquest and alliance. Through her, Alexander tied himself to the eastern nobility he needed to pacify. In time, she would become the mother of his posthumous son. But the farther Alexander moved from Macedon, the more tension grew among his own men. He adopted elements of Persian dress and court ceremony. He appointed Persians to positions of authority. He encouraged fusion between Macedonian and Persian elites. To some, this looked like wisdom. To others, betrayal. Macedonian nobles who had followed him from youth did not want to bow like Persian courtiers. They had crossed the world with him and bled beside him. They expected to be companions of a king, not servants before a godlike monarch. One of the most painful moments came with the killing of Clitus the Black, the same man who had once saved Alexander's life at the Granicus. During a drunken quarrel, Clitus criticized Alexander, defended Philip's legacy, and accused the king of forgetting the men who made him great. The latter, enraged, killed him with a spear or weapon. The next morning, according to tradition, grief overwhelmed him. This scene reveals the tragedy inside Alexander's success. The king who could master battlefields could not always master himself. The farther he rose, the more dangerous his anger became, because no one around him could safely contain it. The conspiracy of the pages and the execution of Callisthenes also darkened these years. Callisthenes, Aristotle's relative and the campaign historian, opposed or became associated with opposition to proskynesis, the act of courtly obeisance that Greeks and Macedonians associated with submission to divine or Persian authority. He was later implicated after a plot against Alexander. The details are tangled, and ancient sources are not neutral. But the larger pattern is clear. The court was becoming tense. The young conqueror's dream of universal kingship placed pressure on the older Macedonian culture of frank speech among companions. Even as tensions deepened, Alexander's army kept moving east. In 327 and 326 BC, he entered the Indian subcontinent, the region that to Greeks and Macedonians represented the edge of known geography and legend. India was not a single kingdom waiting passively. It contained many peoples, rulers, cities, fortresses, and landscapes unfamiliar to the invaders. Taxila welcomed him, but others resisted fiercely. The campaign through mountain regions was difficult and costly. The army had crossed deserts, rivers, and empires, Yet still Alexander wanted more. The phrase, "ends of the earth," had not remained poetry for him. It had become a route. At the Hydaspes River, in 326 BC, Alexander faced King Porus, who commanded a strong army, including war elephants, animals that terrified horses and shocked men unused to them. The battle took place in monsoon conditions, with river crossings, deception, mud, noise, and danger. Alexander used maneuver and surprise to cross at a point away from Porus's main watch, then fought a brutal battle. The elephants made the field strange and horrific. Horses panicked, men were crushed, and the Macedonians had to adapt to a kind of warfare they had never faced on such a scale. Alexander defeated Porus, but the way he treated him became famous. Asked how he wished to be treated, Porus supposedly answered, "Like a king." Alexander restored him and expanded his territory as a subordinate ruler. The anecdote may be shaped by literary taste, but it again shows the image Alexander cultivated: fierce in battle, magnanimous to brave kings, capable of honoring dignity in defeated enemies. Porus represented something Alexander respected. He had stood and fought. In Alexander's moral universe, courage could survive defeat. But after Hydaspes, the army reached its limit. At the Bias River, facing the prospect of still more campaigns eastward, the soldiers refused to go on. They had marched for years, crossed from Europe into Asia, seen friends die, fought Persians, mountain tribes, Sogdian rebels, and Indian kings, and now stood in rain at the edge of another unknown world. Alexander sulked, argued, withdrew to his tent, and tried to bend them by silence and authority. This time, he failed. For the first time, the conqueror could not conquer the exhaustion of his own men. The mutiny at the Bias is one of the most human scenes in the entire story. Alexander could defeat Darius, break Tyre, found cities, cross deserts, and claim divine ancestry, but he could not make tired men stop being tired. Their refusal was not cowardice. It was the body speaking after years of obedience. It was homesickness, grief, fear, and common sense gathered into one collective no. Alexander finally agreed to turn back, though he built altars at the edge of the advance as if marking not defeat, but the boundary of the possible. The return was not gentle. Alexander led part of his forces down the rivers toward the sea, fighting fierce campaigns along the way. At the city of the Malians, he was badly wounded after leaping into the city ahead of most of his men. An arrow pierced his lung or chest area, and for a time, the army feared he would die. The scene shows both his courage and recklessness. He led by example so intensely that he could become a danger to the very army that depended on him. His men loved him partly because he shared danger. They feared for him because he seemed unable to stop seeking it. Nearchus took a fleet along the coast from the Indus toward the Persian Gulf, while Alexander led a terrible march through the Gedrosian desert. The reasons for choosing such a route are debated. It may have been strategic, logistical, competitive with legendary figures, or a disastrous attempt to prove endurance. Whatever the reason, the suffering was immense. Heat, thirst, sand, and lack of supplies killed many. The army that had once glittered across Asia staggered through a landscape that did not care about glory. In the desert, empire becomes very simple. There is water, or there is not. When survivors emerged, Alexander tried to restore order, reward endurance, and reconnect the empire. At Susa in 324 BC, he staged mass weddings between Macedonian officers and Persian noblewomen, while he himself married Statera, daughter of Darius, in addition to his earlier marriage to Roxana. The ceremony was grand and symbolic, meant to fuse ruling elites into one imperial future. But symbols do not always become feelings. Many Macedonians saw these policies as another sign that Alexander had changed. The king dreamed of blending peoples. His men often dreamed of going home. At Opis, Tensions exploded when Alexander announced plans that seemed to favor Persian troops and send some Macedonian veterans home. The soldiers protested. Alexander responded with fury, arrested ringleaders, and then staged a reconciliation in which Persians and Macedonians were symbolically joined in his affection. The scene is hard to read. Was it political theater, genuine emotion, manipulation, or all at once? Alexander could be both wounded and calculating. He wanted to be loved by the men who had followed him, but he also wanted an empire larger than their old assumptions could hold. Then came the death of Hephaestion in 324 BC. Hephaestion was Alexander's closest companion, friend from youth, trusted officer, and perhaps the person most intimately tied to his inner world. Ancient sources describe Alexander's grief as overwhelming. He cut his hair, ordered mourning, planned enormous honors, and seemed shaken in a way even battlefield danger had not produced. For a man who had spent his life chasing comparison with Achilles, the loss of Hephaestion inevitably evoked the loss of Patroclus. Myth and life folded into each other. Glory had not protected him from grief. After Hephaestion's death, Alexander continued planning. He returned to Babylon, the city he may have imagined as the center of his empire. There were plans for Arabia, perhaps the western Mediterranean, perhaps more cities, fleets, roads, and administrative reforms. It is difficult to know which plans were real and which later writers exaggerated, but it is clear that Alexander had not finished in his own mind. At 32, he still looked forward. The empire was vast, but his imagination remained larger than the map. In Babylon, in 323 BC, Alexander fell ill after days of drinking, feasting, and ceremony. Ancient accounts describe fever, weakness, inability to speak, and the army filing past him as he lay dying. The cause of death remains debated. Malaria, typhoid, poisoning, complications of wounds, or other illness have all been suggested. We should be careful not to pretend certainty where historians still disagree. What matters for the story is that the man who had survived arrows, rivers, mountains, deserts, and battles was finally stopped by something no cavalry charge could break. A fever in a palace did what Darius and Porus had not. Alexander died in Babylon in June 323 BC, not yet 33 years old. His empire stretched from Greece and Egypt through Persia toward the Indus, but it depended too heavily on his personal authority. When asked to whom he left the empire, one tradition says he answered, "To the strongest." Whether he said this or not, the phrase became prophecy. His generals, family members, unborn son, half-brother, wives, and commanders were pulled into a struggle that became the wars of the successors. The empire was too large to pass peacefully from a dead young king to an uncertain heir. After his death, his body became part of the struggle for legitimacy. It was eventually taken to Egypt by Ptolemy, one of his generals, and displayed as a sacred royal relic in Alexandria. The conqueror who had founded the city became one of its treasures. Later Roman leaders would visit his tomb. Augustus reportedly looked upon him. Others measured themselves against him, admired him, envied him, or feared the comparison. Then, over centuries, the location of the tomb disappeared from certain knowledge. The man who wanted the world became, in the end, a lost body beneath layers of city, legend, and time. Alexander's legacy is almost impossible to hold in one hand. He destroyed and founded. He spread Greek language and culture across regions where new Hellenistic kingdoms would emerge. He opened routes of exchange and also left fields of death behind him. He honored local gods and burned palaces. He admired brave enemies and killed old friends in rage. He imagined unity and practiced domination. To call him simply great is to use the language history gave him. To understand him is to let the greatness remain complicated. The cities he founded or renamed became points of contact between cultures. Greek settlers, local populations, soldiers, merchants, artisans, administrators, and priests created new hybrid worlds. In Egypt, the Ptolemies ruled from Alexandria. In Asia, Seleucid kings inherited vast territories. In Bactria and beyond, Greek artistic and political forms mingled with local traditions. Alexander did not personally design every consequence. No conqueror controls the future so neatly, but his campaigns cracked open the old map and made new patterns possible. For the people who suffered his campaigns, the story looked different. Cities besieged, families enslaved, local rulers overthrown, soldiers conscripted, villages taxed, and landscapes crossed by hungry armies would not have experienced Alexander as a romantic hero. History often remembers the view from horseback, not the view from the city wall. A calm retelling should leave room for both. The boy who conquered the world was also the storm many people had to survive. The same torch that lights one legend can burn another person's home. There is also the question of why he kept going. Was it ambition, insecurity, heroic imitation, strategic necessity, curiosity, divine belief, or the momentum of success? The answer is probably all of them, shifting from year to year. At 20, he needed to secure his throne. At 22, he avenged Greece and challenged Persia. After Issus, he wanted more than victory. After Egypt, perhaps he believed in something sacred around his destiny. After Gaugamela, stopping may have felt more impossible than continuing. Success can become a road with no visible place to rest. In the quiet of this story, we can picture Alexander not at the height of battle, but in smaller moments. A young prince stroking Bucephalus under the sun, a student listening to Aristotle, a king standing before the sea at Tyre, refusing to accept that water could protect a city from him, a man in the desert after Siwa, carrying words from an oracle, a commander under the fires of Gaugamela, looking across a plain at the empire he meant to take, a grieving friend after Hephaestion's death, a fevered body in Babylon, while soldiers passed by in silence. Perhaps that is why Alexander remains powerful as a subject for sleep history. His life feels both enormous and brief. He burned through the world quickly, like a meteor that leaves light and damage together. He did not have the long old age in which many rulers become administrators of their own legend. He died before his plans could settle, before his empire could become ordinary, before anyone could know whether his dream of fusion would endure or collapse. His unfinished life made him endlessly reusable. Every age finds a different Alexander: hero, tyrant, genius, visionary, destroyer, explorer, warning. When we say, "the boy who conquered the world," we are speaking partly in legend, because Alexander did not conquer the whole world. He conquered the world as it existed in his imagination and in the geography of his ambition. Beyond the Bees River, there were kingdoms he never saw. Beyond Arabia, plans unrealized. Beyond the Mediterranean, powers he never touched. But the phrase survives because from Macedon to Egypt, from Babylon to the Indus, his movement felt world-sized to those who witnessed it. He stretched the horizon of what a single life could attempt. And now, after all the marching, the story can slow. The horses are quiet, the sarissas are stacked, the maps curl at the edges, the fires of Persepolis have gone out, the rivers run as they always did. Babylon is silent under centuries. Alexandria has changed again and again. The tomb is lost, the companions are dust. The empire broke, but the name remained, carried by histories, legends, coins, paintings, manuscripts, schoolbooks, and whispered comparisons whenever someone rises too fast and wants too much. So let the final image be simple. A young king stands at the edge of a river, looking east. Behind him are years of victory, grief, and exhaustion. Ahead of him is a world he will never fully enter. For once, he cannot command the men to move forward. For once, the world says no. He builds altars there, not because the journey is complete, but because even Alexander must mark the place where desire meets the limit of human strength. The river keeps flowing, the rain falls softly, the army turns back, and you can rest now with that image. The boy from Macedon, the student of Aristotle, the rider of Bucephalus, the king of Asia, the founder of cities, the breaker of empires, the grieving friend, the fevered man in Babylon. His story is not asking you to solve it tonight. It can remain as history often remains, half illuminated and half shadowed, full of beauty, danger, greatness, and sorrow. Let the marching fade into distance. Let the names become soft. Let the ancient roads disappear beneath the night, and let sleep come quietly, like desert wind over a forgotten map. Before Alexander was born, Macedon had already learned what insecurity felt like. The kingdom sat between powerful cultures, mountain tribes, Greek cities, and the ambitions of rival dynasties. Its kings had to be warriors, diplomats, patrons, and survivors. Philip had spent part of his youth as a hostage in Thebes, where he observed Greek military methods and political systems. He returned to Macedon with lessons that would reshape the kingdom. He did not merely inherit strength, he manufactured it. The army Alexander would later use was not a miracle appearing from nowhere. It was the result of reforms, discipline, and years of pressure applied by a father who understood that the old Macedon could not survive in the new world without transformation. Philip's marriages also shaped Alexander's world. Royal marriage in Macedon was not only private affection, it was alliance, legitimacy, and danger. Olympias was one wife among several, and the politics of succession could become poisonous. When Philip later married Cleopatra Eurydice, a Macedonian noblewoman, tensions rose, because any son from that marriage might be seen by some as more purely Macedonian than Macedonian. Alexander, whose mother came from Epirus, at a wedding feast, an insult reportedly suggested this very danger. Alexander reacted fiercely, and Philip, drunk, stumbled while trying to draw a weapon. The scene, whether embellished or not, shows the instability behind palace splendor. The future conqueror grew up watching family and politics bleed into each other. The Macedonian court was not a peaceful school of manners. Young noblemen served as royal pages, learning obedience, hunting, riding, and the dangerous intimacy of palace life. They were close enough to power to desire it, but close enough to punishment to fear it. Alexander learned early that kingship was theatrical. A king had to appear brave, generous, terrifying, divinely favored, and stronger than faction. Every feast had listeners, every gesture had meaning, every friendship could someday become a political problem. This atmosphere trained Alexander in suspicion as much as leadership. He would later live surrounded by companions, yet increasingly isolated by the crown they helped him win. The Macedonian army itself deserves a slower look, because it was the instrument that made Alexander's dream possible. The phalanx did not look like individual heroism. It was collective discipline, rows of men holding long sarissas so that several spear points projected ahead of the front line. A man in such a formation depended on the steadiness of the men beside him. The companion cavalry, by contrast, gave Alexander the dramatic striking force he loved. Noble horsemen, capable of charging into openings created by infantry pressure. Around them moved archers, javelin men, engineers, scouts, siege specialists, and supply workers. The army was a moving organism, not a crowd with swords. Philip's genius lay partly in combining these pieces. Alexander's genius lay in using them with speed and imagination. On campaign, he often fixed the enemy with one part of his army while seeking a decisive moment with cavalry. Later writers sometimes simplify this into the hammer and anvil idea, infantry holding, cavalry striking, but real battles were messier than diagrams. Dust blinded men, horses panicked, orders were misunderstood, terrain interfered. Courage broke or held unpredictably. Alexander's battlefield talent was not that he commanded a machine in perfect conditions, it was that he could sense openings in chaos and act before the moment closed. When he crossed into Asia, Alexander also carried a carefully chosen political message. He was not only invading for himself. He claimed to lead Greeks in revenge for the Persian invasions of the 5th century BC, when Xerxes had burned temples and threatened Greek independence. This language mattered because it turned Macedonian conquest into a shared Greek cause, at least officially. But there is irony here. Many Greeks had no desire to be ruled by Macedon, and some fought for Persia as mercenaries. The simple story of Greek freedom against Persian tyranny does not capture the tangled reality. Still, slogans have power, and Alexander understood the uses of memory. The Granicus showed how close glory could come to disaster. Ancient accounts describe Persian nobles recognizing Alexander by his armor and attacking him directly. In heroic literature, kings meet kings and champions seek champions, but on a real battlefield, this meant danger concentrated around one man. If Alexander had died at the Granicus, history would remember him as a reckless young king who attempted too much and vanished early. Instead, he survived, and survival converted recklessness into legend. That is one of history's quiet tricks. The same decision can be called foolish if it fails, and magnificent if it succeeds. After Granicus, Alexander sent captured armor back to Athens with an inscription presenting the victory as revenge on behalf of Greeks, except the Spartans, who had not joined his league. This little political sting reminds us that Alexander never forgot the theater of reputation. A battle won in Asia still needed to be interpreted back in Greece. News traveled, monuments spoke, dedications shaped memory. He was fighting Darius's empire, but he was also fighting for a place in Greek imagination. He wanted the old cities, even those that disliked him, to understand that something enormous was happening and that he stood at its center. The march through Asia Minor brought Alexander into contact with cities that had their own histories, factions, hopes, and fears. Some communities preferred Persian rule, some preferred autonomy, some saw Macedon as liberation, and some simply wanted survival. For ordinary people, the arrival of an army meant uncertainty before ideology. Soldiers need food, horses need fodder, commanders need money. Even friendly occupation can become a burden. In the calmness of this retelling, it is worth seeing the villagers who watched dust rising on the road and wondered whether the approaching standards meant opportunity, ruin, or just another ruler demanding taxes. At Halicarnassus, Alexander faced stubborn resistance and the complexity of siege warfare. Walls slow down even brilliant commanders. Siege engines must be built, protected, advanced, repaired, and coordinated. Defenders burn towers, launch missiles, counterattack, and wait for disease or frustration to weaken the besiegers. The fame of Alexander's cavalry sometimes hides the patient violence of his engineers. Without siegecraft, Tyre would have remained impossible, Gaza unreachable, and many cities unconquered. The ancient world was won not only by charges in open fields, but by carpenters, miners, rope-makers, smiths, and men who knew how stone breaks under repeated force. The story of the Gordian knot, whether literal or symbolic, gave Alexander something every conqueror needs, a legend that explains his style. Cutting the knot is such a powerful image because it makes impatience look like genius. But there is more to it. Many rulers become trapped in inherited rules, trying to solve old problems by old methods. Alexander's career often depended on refusing the expected pace. He moved before opponents were ready, attacked before caution hardened, negotiated when force was wasteful, and used ceremony when violence had already done enough. The knot was not only rope, it was the world's assumption that problems must be solved politely. At Issus, the capture of the Persian royal family created an intimate drama inside a vast, military struggle. Darius's mother, Sisygambis, reportedly mistook Hephaestion for Alexander because Hephaestion was taller or more imposing. Alexander is said to have reassured her that Hephaestion too was Alexander, a line that later ages found beautiful because it suggested a friendship almost royal in itself. Whether exact or not, the story reveals how closely Alexander's identity was tied to his companions. He did not travel alone into greatness. A circle of men from youth moved with him, and their closeness made later betrayals and losses more painful. The siege of Tyre also showed Alexander's refusal to leave enemies behind him. Tyre's island position gave it confidence. Its walls rose above the sea, and its fleet complicated any direct assault. Alexander's decision to build the mole from shore to island was audacious, but the sea punished every foot of progress. Workers labored under missiles. Storms damaged construction. Tyrian ships attacked siege towers. The project required adaptation after adaptation, including naval support from cities that shifted allegiance to Alexander. In the end, Tyre fell because persistence, engineering, and political momentum converged. The island that trusted distance discovered that distance could be filled. Egypt gave Alexander a different kind of victory. No great battle announced it, but the symbolism may have been just as powerful. To be accepted by Egypt was to step into one of the oldest traditions of sacred kingship in the sea, Mediterranean world. Egyptian religion, temple ritual, and royal imagery offered Alexander a vocabulary far older than Macedon. He did not need to destroy Egypt to possess it. He needed to appear within its order. This ability to wear different forms of legitimacy was one reason he moved so successfully through diverse lands. He did not always demand that conquered peoples understand him only as Macedonian. He allowed them to name him through their own sacred language. The foundation of Alexandria was practical as well as symbolic. The site had access to the Mediterranean, proximity to the Nile, and potential as a trading center. A city there could connect Egypt to the Greek world and project power across sea routes. Later greatness should not make us forget that at the moment of founding, it was a plan drawn into earth, a king's decision translated into measurements, streets, and labor. Surveyors, workers, soldiers, and local populations would have turned imagination into walls. The city's future library and lighthouse belonged to later generations, but Alexander's act opened the space where that future could unfold. The journey to Siwa is one of the most dreamlike episodes in the story, perfect for a quiet night retelling. The desert strips away noise. Armies become vulnerable there, reduced to waterskins, guides, animals, and the mercy of weather. Later writers loved the idea that nature itself guided Alexander, but even if we set miracles aside, the journey tells us something. Alexander was willing to spend time and risk movement for an oracle. Strategy alone does not explain that. He sought sacred confirmation, personal meaning, and perhaps a form of kingship that reached beyond ordinary inheritance. The desert did not give him land. It gave him language. After Egypt, the road to Gaugamela felt like the narrowing of fate. Darius gathered again because he had to. A great king could not simply surrender the empire after Issus. He prepared open ground for cavalry and chariots, leveling parts of the battlefield to make his advantages more useful. Alexander's army approached, knowing that this might be the decisive test. We can imagine the sounds before dawn, armor adjusted, horses watered, officers speaking softly, campfires dying, men thinking of home, pay, glory, fear, and the strange fact that by sunset the world might belong to a different king. Gaugamela's victory did not happen because Alexander was fearless alone. It happened because the army had been trained to respond to difficult movement. The oblique advance, the refusal to be enveloped, the control of reserves, and the ability to exploit a gap required trust, built over years. Alexander's charge toward Darius has become the painting, the memory, the dramatic center. But beneath that moment were thousands of disciplined acts, by men whose names mostly disappeared. History often attaches victory to one figure, but the dust of Gaugamela was full of anonymous obedience, terror, and skill. Babylon's surrender must have felt unreal. Greek imagination already saw Babylon as ancient, luxurious, and immense. For Macedonian soldiers from mountain villages, its scale may have seemed like entering a story told by merchants and travelers. Priests came out, officials negotiated, the city received Alexander, and Alexander received the city. He understood enough to honor Marduk and local customs, showing that he did not intend to rule by insult where reverence would serve better. This is a quieter form of intelligence than battlefield brilliance, but perhaps just as important. Empires last longer when conquered cities can imagine continuity. Susa and Persepolis revealed the material reality of Persian power. Treasuries held wealth accumulated across generations. Gold and silver became wages, rewards, logistics, and symbolism. The Macedonian army had not merely defeated another army, it had taken possession of imperial resources. Yet wealth brings complications. Paying soldiers creates loyalty, but luxury can also soften discipline, widen inequality, and tempt commanders into rival ambitions. Alexander distributed, stored, moved, and displayed treasure as part of rule. Behind the shining metal lay the question every conqueror faces: once you have taken wealth, can you control what it does to your own people? The burning of Persepolis remains one of the great symbolic uncertainties. If it was revenge, it connected Alexander to Greek memory of Persian destruction. If it was drunken destruction, it revealed the danger of impulse at the heart of power. If it was calculated theater, it marked the end of the old Achaemenid order in fire. The ambiguity makes the scene stronger, not weaker. History rarely gives us pure motives. A king can act for revenge, intoxication, symbolism, and pressure from companions all in the same night. Flames do not record why they were lit, they only consume. When Alexander pursued Bessus after Darius's murder, he was also pursuing legitimacy. Bessus had taken the royal name Artaxerxes and tried to claim succession in the east. Alexander could not allow that claim to harden. By punishing Darius's killer, he appeared as defender of royal justice, even while he himself had destroyed Darius's power. This is one of the strange moral inversions of conquest. Alexander could be both the invader who made Darius desperate and the avenger who honored him after betrayal. Politics lives easily with contradictions when victory protects them. Bactria and Sogdiana changed the mood of the campaign. The landscape was harsher for Macedonian methods, and local resistance did not gather conveniently into one decisive army. Spitamenes and others used mobility, terrain, and local knowledge. Alexander had to divide forces, build posts, conduct sieges, negotiate marriages, punish rebellions, and endure frustration. These years wore at the army's nerves. A glorious war of revenge against Persia had become something more like occupation at the edge of the known world. Soldiers who once imagined returning home, rich and famous, now found themselves guarding remote places whose languages and winters felt alien. The capture of the Sogdian rock became another legend of impossibility overcome. Defenders supposedly said Alexander would need soldiers with wings to take the fortress. He found climbers who scaled the heights, and the sight of Macedonians above them broke resistance. There, according to tradition, he encountered Roxana. The episode reads almost like romance, but it was also policy. Marrying Roxana helped bind him to local aristocracy, and the story of love softened the hard edges of strategic alliance. Ancient history often preserves politics in the clothing of beauty. Roxana's later life reminds us that women in these stories often become visible only when connected to male power. She married the most famous man in the world, carried his child, and after his death, entered the lethal politics of succession. For a moment in the campaign narrative, she appears as the beautiful daughter of a defeated region. But she was also a survivor in a court where marriage, pregnancy, and legitimacy could become matters of life and death. The world Alexander made did not become peaceful for those closest to him. It became more dangerous because so many futures depended on his bloodline. Alexander's adoption of Persian dress and ceremony was not a small matter of clothing. Clothing tells people who stands above whom. Macedonian companions had known a court where kingship, though powerful, still included rough intimacy, drinking, argument, and shared danger. Persian court forms created distance. They made the king more radiant and less reachable. Alexander may have believed such forms necessary for ruling Asia, but his old companions saw a young man becoming something unfamiliar. To build a universal empire, he had to change. But every change threatened the bond with the men who had followed him from the beginning. The killing of Clitus can be understood only if we remember the emotional pressure of these changes. Clitus represented the old Macedonian voice, blunt, proud, loyal to Philip's memory, unwilling to flatter Alexander's divinity. In drunken anger, Alexander crossed a line no victory could erase. He killed not an enemy, but a savior. The grief afterwards suggests he understood the horror, yet repentance could not restore Clitus. In this scene, Alexander's story becomes almost Greek tragedy, a hero lifted above normal men, destroyed not by weakness alone, but by the excess of the very qualities that made him great. The proskynesis controversy revealed a related wound. In Persian contexts, prostration or courtly obeisance could signify hierarchy before the king. To Greeks, such gestures often suggested worship or servility unsuitable for free men before a mortal ruler. Alexander tried to bridge cultures through ceremony, but symbols do not translate cleanly. What one culture sees as court etiquette, another may see as humiliation. The failure of proskynesis shows that empire is not only a matter of laws and armies, it is a matter of bodies, gestures, pride, and the meanings people attach to bending their knees. India drew Alexander partly because of geography, inherited from Persian imperial claims, and partly because of imagination. Greek knowledge of India mixed fact, rumor, marvel, and old stories. To march there was to push against the edge of the known, but for the peoples living there, Alexander was not approaching the edge of the world. He was entering their world, with its own powers and politics. This reversal matters. Conquerors often imagine themselves discovering horizons. Those horizons are already someone else's home. The battle against Porus at the Hydaspes deserves a slow visual unfolding. Rain on river water, watchfires along the bank. Alexander, moving troops secretly at night. Thunder, masking movement. Horses, uneasy in the storm. Porus, waiting with elephants, infantry, chariots and cavalry. Then the crossing, the confusion, the recognition that the Macedonians had appeared where they were not expected. Ancient battles were not clean lines on a map. They were weather, noise, animal fear, mud under sandals, shouted orders, and the terrible surprise of forms of war one had never faced before. War elephants changed the psychology of battle. A horse could be trained, brave, and disciplined, yet still panic at the smell and sound of elephants. Men who had fought cavalry and infantry for years now faced living towers that could crush bodies, break lines, and keep fighting even when wounded. The Macedonians adapted, targeting drivers, surrounding animals, using discipline against shock. Their victory at Hydaspes was not easy. It cost them, and it showed that the farther they marched, the more the world introduced new forms of resistance. The death of Bucephalus after the Hydaspes, whether from wounds, age, or exhaustion, became another emotional marker. Alexander founded a city named Bucephala in honor of the horse. The boy, who had once turned the animal toward the sun, had carried him across the world. To lose Bucephalus near the farthest edge of the campaign must have felt like losing a living thread back to childhood. In heroic stories, horses are more than transport. They are companions, symbols of youth, extensions of the rider's will. Bucephalus's death belonged to the slow ending of Alexander's eastward dream. When the army refused at the Bias, Alexander confronted a truth that kings dislike. Loyalty has limits. The soldiers had obeyed through hardships almost beyond imagining. Their refusal did not mean they no longer admired him. It meant admiration could no longer overcome exhaustion. Coenus, one of his officers, reportedly spoke for the men, urging return. Alexander was furious, but the silence of the army held. In that silence, the world shifted. Until then, Alexander's desire had been the engine of history. At the Bias, the engine stalled before the collective will of men who had given enough. The altars Alexander built at the eastern limit were a brilliant act of reframing. He could not honestly call the refusal a victory, but he could transform the stopping point into sacred memory. The altars said, "We came this far." They marked the edge not as shame, but as monument. This was one of Alexander's gifts. He understood how to turn events into symbols. A retreat could become a ritual boundary. A disappointment could become a place future stories would remember. The army turned back, but the altars allowed him to leave a statement facing the lands he never conquered. The voyage down the rivers exposed the army to another kind of campaign. Boats, currents, unfamiliar peoples along the banks, sudden resistance, and the difficulty of moving a large force through river systems. Alexander's wound among the Malians shocked the army because it nearly severed the entire imperial project in a moment. He had climbed too far ahead, as if still trying to prove something no one needed proved. When rumors of his death spread, panic followed. The army did not merely love its king, it depended on him structurally. Without Alexander, the whole expedition might become a trapped body with no head. The Gedrosian Desert March is a difficult episode to make sense of, and perhaps that is why it haunts the story. Ancient writers emphasize terrible losses. Men died of thirst, heat, exhaustion, and despair. Supplies failed. The landscape reduced rank and glory to endurance. Some have suggested Alexander chose the route to surpass legendary figures such as Cyrus or Semiramis, who had failed there. If so, ambition had become cruel, not only to enemies, but to his own men. If logistics forced the decision, it was still a disaster. Either way, the desert stripped conquest of romance. After returning west, Alexander faced the administrative problem of holding everything. He could win faster than institutions could settle. For governors misbehaved, treasurers took advantage, local arrangements needed correction. Westerns wanted reward, new troops needed integration, Persian nobles expected respect, Macedonian officers expected privilege. Alexander's empire was not a finished building. It was scaffolding around motion. He kept moving, deciding, punishing, reconciling, founding, marrying, and planning. But the question remained, could one man's energy become a stable world after he stopped moving? The Susa weddings were beautiful and uneasy. Imagine the hall filled with Macedonian officers, Persian noblewomen, rich fabrics, ceremonial gestures, gold cups, music, translators, and watching eyes. To Alexander, perhaps, this was the visible birth of a new ruling class. To many participants, it may have been obedience dressed as celebration. After Alexander's death, many of these marriages were abandoned. That fact does not make the ceremony meaningless, but it shows the difference between a king's symbolic vision and the private loyalties of individuals. Fusion cannot be commanded as easily as a cavalry charge. At Opis, when Alexander reconciled with his Macedonians, the emotional language of family appeared. He called them kinsmen. Persians, too, were admitted into closeness. The scene suggests both generosity and pressure. Alexander wanted to enlarge identity itself, making Macedonian and Persian elites share one imperial household. But identity is stubborn. Men who had spent years imagining themselves conquerors did not easily accept equality with the conquered. Alexander saw an empire. Many Macedonians saw their rewards being diluted. The conflict was not only prejudice, it was about what victory had been promised to mean. Hephaestion's death broke something intimate. Public grief could become policy, and Alexander's mourning did. Cities, temples, honors, and ceremonies were planned. But behind the excessive gestures was a simple human wound. The person who had known him before Asia, before Siwa, before Babylon, before the titles, was gone. Hephaestion had been companion across the transformation. Without him, Alexander was surrounded by empire, but deprived of a witness to his earlier self. That kind of grief can feel like losing not only a friend, but a version of oneself that only the friend remembered. Babylon at the end of Alexander's life is almost too symbolic. The ancient city receiving the young conqueror one final time. Envoys came from many lands. Plans multiplied. Ships and armies were discussed. Sacrifices were offered. Omens reportedly troubled some around him. Ancient writers loved omens because the death of a great figure seems, in retrospect, too important to arrive without warning. Whether the signs happened or were embroidered later, they create the atmosphere of a world holding its breath. Alexander entered Babylon not knowing it would become the last room of his story. The illness unfolded slowly enough to create dread. A man whose body had been the center of so much action became still. The voice that had ordered marches, cities, executions, reconciliations, and battles weakened. Soldiers were allowed to file past him, and he may have acknowledged them silently when speech failed. This image is profoundly moving because the army that once followed him across continents now moved past his bed in farewell. They had seen him in armor, in anger, in triumph. Now they saw him reduced to breath, fever, and eyes. His death did not end his power immediately. In some ways, it released it into myth. Living rulers disappoint. Dead conquerors become available to imagination. His generals used his name, his body, his family, and his legacy to support their claims. His half-brother, Philip Aridaeus, and unborn son by Roxana, became fragile symbols in a game, controlled by stronger men. The empire's unity had depended on Alexander's presence. Without him, ambition fragmented into kingdoms. The boy who had conquered so much left behind a world in which everyone closest to power became less safe. The Hellenistic age that followed was not simply the ruins of his failure. It was also a world of new cities, blended cultures, scientific curiosity, royal courts, libraries, trade routes, art forms, and philosophical exchange. Greek became a language of administration and culture across large regions. Egyptian, Persian, Babylonian, Jewish, Central Asian, and Indian worlds interacted with Greek forms in ways that cannot be reduced to one man's will. Alexander opened doors violently, but what came through those doors was larger than him. History often grows from wounds into shapes no conqueror planned. For viewers listening at night, Alexander's story can become almost like the movement of a star across the sky. Bright, fast, impossible to ignore, then gone. Yet the darkness after him was not empty. It filled with successors, cities, queens, philosophers, wars, libraries, legends, and new worlds of art. The light did not vanish. It scattered. That may be the truest image of his legacy. He did not build a lasting single empire, but he scattered sparks across regions that burned in different colors for centuries. There is no need to decide tonight Whether Alexander was hero or monster, he was both less simple and more interesting. He was a young man shaped by parents, teachers, poetry, violence, opportunity, and extraordinary talent. He was also a king responsible for suffering on a vast scale. The ancient world did not separate greatness from brutality as cleanly as modern minds sometimes wish. To study him honestly is to resist making him either pure inspiration or pure warning. He can be a lesson in courage, ambition, charisma, adaptation, excess, grief, and the danger of wanting the horizon to move every time you reach it. If you imagine him now, imagine not the marble statue first, but the movement. A boy running in Macedonian dust, a prince listening to Homer, a horse turning toward the sun, a river crossed at dawn, a city burning at night, a desert swallowing footsteps, a friend mourned too deeply for politics to contain, a fevered king in Babylon. These images are quieter than the word conquest, and perhaps more truthful. Empires are made of scenes like these, small and enormous at once, each one carrying a human breath inside the machinery of history. Alexander's name survived in many languages and traditions. In some, he became a philosopher king. In others, a seeker of the water of life, a builder of gates against monstrous peoples, a figure who traveled to the edges of the world and beyond. These legends tell us that history could not contain him neatly. Once a life becomes symbolic, cultures reshape it according to their own fears and desires. The real Alexander died in Babylon. The imagined Alexander kept traveling, entering romances, religious stories, medieval maps, Persian poetry, Arabic traditions, and European chronicles. Conquest ended, narrative did not. The calmest ending may be to return to Macedon, to the land before the march. Hills, horses, cold mornings, royal tombs, and the young prince who did not yet know how far his name would travel. Every life, even the largest, begins in a place small enough for childhood. Alexander's later world stretched to Babylon and the Indus, but the first world was made of family voices, teachers, animals, rivalries, and stories told by firelight. Somewhere in that beginning was the seed of a man who would never be satisfied with what was near. Sleep now can hold the story without judgment. The phalanx fades, the elephants fade, the palace fires fade, Darius disappears into the east. Porus stands beside his elephants in the rain. Roxana waits in a court full of danger. Hephaestion's funeral smoke rises. Babylon grows quiet. And Alexander, who chased the end of the world, becomes still at last. The road continues without him, as roads always do, running through memory, dust, and dream. Let us slow the story even further and think about the maps Alexander never saw in the way we see maps. His world was built from reports, travelers, royal roads, sailors, merchants, myths, and inherited geography. The farther east he went, the more imagination and intelligence had to work together. Rivers became questions. Mountains became rumors before they became obstacles. The edge of knowledge was not a clean line, but a mist. To march into that mist required courage, but also arrogance. Because every unknown land was already known by the people who lived there, Alexander's wonder and their reality met on the same road. The Persian Empire he attacked was not a decaying shell waiting to collapse, though victorious narratives often make it seem so. It was a complex imperial system that had lasted for generations, capable of gathering tribute, building roads, respecting many local traditions, and ruling diverse peoples through satraps and royal authority. Alexander's achievement becomes more impressive, not less, when we grant Persia its strength. He did not defeat emptiness. He defeated a living empire. But he also inherited many of its methods, because no one can rule vast territories by courage alone. In conquering Persia, he became dependent on Persian experience. Darius III also deserves more than being remembered as the man who ran away. He inherited a difficult position, faced internal instability, and confronted an enemy whose speed and battlefield aggression were unusual. At Issus and Gaugamela, his flight has often been treated as cowardice, but kings were also symbols. If Darius died too early, resistance could collapse immediately. If he survived, the empire still had a center. Survival in battle could be strategy as well as fear. Alexander's legend needed Darius as defeated opposite, but history can be kinder and admit that the Persian king faced a nearly impossible crisis. Alexander's relationship with Greek culture was also layered. He loved Homer and sought Greek recognition, but he was Macedonian, and many Greeks saw Macedonian rule as domination. Athens, Thebes, Sparta, and other cities had long traditions of pride. The idea that Alexander simply led a united Greek world is too smooth. Some admired him, some feared him, some resented him, some served him, and some took Persian pay against him. His empire carried Greek culture outward, but it was born from the military supremacy of Macedon over many Greeks who would have preferred their own freedom. The companions around Alexander were not merely supporting characters. Parmenion represented older military experience inherited from Philip. Philotas, Parmenion's son, became entangled in accusations and was executed. Craterus was beloved by the Macedonian troops. Perdiccas would become powerful after Alexander's death. Ptolemy would take Egypt and eventually secure Alexander's body. Seleucus would found a dynasty across Asia. Hephaestion was the intimate companion. These men formed a moving court of ambition. While Alexander lived, his gravity held them in orbit. After he died, they became sons of their own smaller systems. The execution of Philotas and the killing of Parmenion marked another turning point. Philotas was accused of involvement in conspiracy, and Parmenion, though far away and not necessarily proven guilty, was killed because his power made him dangerous if his son had been executed. This is the logic of monarchy at war. Security often moves faster than justice. Alexander may have believed the danger real. He may have acted from necessity, but the effect on the court must have been chilling. Old service no longer guaranteed safety. The king who rewarded loyalty also eliminated threats with ruthless speed. We should remember that Alexander was wounded many times. Ancient accounts list injuries from swords, arrows, stones, and missiles. His body carried the campaign physically. This mattered to soldiers. A king who bleeds beside men earns a kind of loyalty no speech can create, but repeated wounds also accumulate. Pain, scars, fatigue, drinking, stress, grief, and pressure may have shaped his later temperament. It is easy to discuss Alexander as pure will, but will lives inside a body. By the final years, that body had been driven across climates, battles, fevers, and emotional extremes almost without rest. The army's camp life was its own traveling world. There were soldiers, servants, engineers, physicians, grooms, cooks, merchants, families in some contexts, prisoners, interpreters, scribes, and local guides. Fires burned at night in ordered spaces. Animals needed care. Weapons needed repair. Rumors moved faster than official announcements. Men gambled, argued, sang, remembered home, and wondered how much farther the king could possibly ask them to go. A 2-hour sleep story can linger here because empire is not only what happens in palaces, it is also what happens in the dark between marches, when ordinary men try to sleep with tomorrow's battle nearby. Alexander's use of cities as anchors across his empire tells us something about how he imagined permanence. A city could hold a garrison, organize trade, reward veterans, project culture, and mark royal presence. But founding a city on campaign was not simply drawing a name on a map. It affected local populations, land use, labor, and power. Some cities thrived, some remained military settlements, some changed names and identities over time. Each one was a promise that Macedonian movement would become structure. Each one also asked whether men trained for war could become settlers of peace. In Egypt and Asia, Alexander encountered forms of kingship far older and more ceremonial than Macedonian practice. The pharaoh, the great king, the son of a god, the lord of lands, these titles were not decoration. They were systems of meaning that told subjects how the universe was ordered. Alexander's willingness to enter these systems shows flexibility, but also temptation. If every culture tells a victorious young man that kingship reaches toward divinity, he may begin to breathe that air too easily. The danger of conquest is not only that others submit to you, it is that their submission teaches you false things about yourself. The story of Alexander and Diogenes, though difficult to verify historically, survives because it offers a perfect contrast. The conqueror visits the philosopher, supposedly asking what he can do for him, and Diogenes answers that Alexander can stand out of his sunlight. The richest ambition meets the poorest independence. Whether or not the meeting happened exactly so, the anecdote asks a question the whole life asks. What does the man who wants everything lack? Perhaps he lacks the freedom of needing nothing. Alexander could command armies, but Diogenes in the story commands himself. Aristotle's influence on Alexander is also complicated. Later, people like to imagine a straight line from philosopher to enlightened conqueror, but education does not control a life. Aristotle may have shaped Alexander's love of Greek literature, inquiry, classification, and perhaps interest in natural observation. Yet Alexander's policies toward Persians eventually moved beyond what many Greeks would have expected or approved. The student did not simply enact the teacher's ideas. He absorbed, resisted, transformed, and outgrew. A young mind can be trained by philosophy and still become a man of war. When Alexander visited the tomb of Cyrus the Great at Pasargadae, he reportedly ordered it restored after it had been damaged or violated. This gesture matters. Cyrus was not merely a defeated predecessor, he was a model of empire. By honoring Cyrus, Alexander placed himself in a lineage of great kings rather than presenting himself only as destroyer. The act also signaled to Persians that he respected imperial memory. Conquerors often destroy symbols of legitimacy, but they also borrow them. Alexander could burn Persepolis and honor Cyrus. Again, contradiction sits at the center of him. The Macedonian veterans who eventually returned west carried stories that must have sounded impossible. They had seen the Nile and Babylon, the palaces of Persia, the mountains of Central Asia, the elephants of India, deserts that killed men, rivers wider than imagination, and a king who seemed to belong equally to glory and danger. Their memories became part of how the ancient world understood distance. To people at home, the returning soldiers were living bridges to places once known mostly by rumor. Even when the empire broke, the experience of having crossed it did not vanish. Alexander's drinking is often mentioned by ancient sources, sometimes as part of Macedonian custom, sometimes as moral criticism. Feasting, wine, companionship, and competition were woven into elite Macedonian life. But heavy drinking around absolute power can become dangerous, as the Cleitus episode shows. In the drinking hall, old grievances find voice. Praise becomes excessive. Insults become fatal. The king is both companion and judge, friend and executioner. The cup passes around, and for a few hours, hierarchy feels softer, until suddenly everyone remembers that one man in the room can kill without consequence. The longing for the ocean, the outer sea, appears in stories about Alexander's ambitions. Ancient geography imagined the inhabited world surrounded by water, and reaching that boundary meant touching cosmic completion. This helps explain why turning back in India hurt him so much. He was not merely seeking another province, he was seeking the satisfaction of finishing the map. But the world is not shaped to satisfy ambition. Every horizon reveals another. The tragedy of limitless desire is that no final river announces, with certainty, that the longing can end. After Alexander's death, his mother Olympias, his wife Roxana, his son Alexander IV, his half-brother Philip Aridaeus, and many others became trapped in violent succession politics. The family that had produced the Conqueror was consumed by the vacuum he left. This is an important afterimage. Glory did not protect his household. His mother was eventually killed. Roxana and her son were eventually murdered. The Argead line collapsed. The man who chased immortality through conquest could not secure ordinary safety for his own blood after death. The Hellenistic kingdoms that followed Alexander created a new political landscape. Ptolemaic Egypt, Seleucid Asia, Antigonid Macedon, and other successor powers fought, negotiated, intermarried, and patronized culture. Greek cities in Asia became centers of exchange. Art changed, becoming more emotional and dramatic in some forms. Science and scholarship flourished in places such as Alexandria, but wars also continued for generations. Alexander's death did not bring peace. It redistributed ambition into the hands of men who had learned from him that vast kingdoms could be seized by force. One reason Alexander is so suitable for a long sleep documentary is that his story has waves: childhood, first command, invasion, coastal war, Egypt, decisive battle, imperial inheritance, eastern resistance, India, return, grief, death. Each wave rises and falls, carrying the listener forward without needing constant shock. The video can be calming because the narration moves like a long road, but the topic remains engaging because every stage changes the scale. A boy becomes a king becomes conqueror, a conqueror becomes an almost mythic figure. Then the body fails, and the myth begins. For your final video, the tone should not be too aggressive, even though the title is powerful. Sleep and Seek viewers need intensity softened into atmosphere. Let battles feel cinematic, but not frantic. Let violence be acknowledged without becoming harsh. Let the emotional anchor be the boyhood to world conquest arc. The strongest hook is not merely that Alexander conquered land, it is that he did it before most people have truly become adults, and then died before he had time to understand what he had made. That sadness gives the story depth beyond military facts.